Have you ever wondered where you really stand with God? Are you overcome with feelings of guilt because of things you've done wrong? Are you tired of religion that focuses on rules that you can't keep? Have we got good news for you? It's time to listen in on some casual conversation with Mike Kapler and Joel Brueseke and discover what true freedom is all about. This is Growing in Grace.
Congratulations. Let me be the first to say you've done a good job. You found us. The Growing in Grace podcast. I'm Mike Kapler. I am with Joel Brueseke, and we are found at growingingrace.org. I talked to somebody today, Joel, who enjoys tuning in on the podcasts and said that sometimes he listens to them on Sunday when they are posted, but other times he can't, and he has to pick up on it like on Wednesday. And I thought about it, and I said, that's a great thing that we have now. Is in the old days, to catch a radio program, for example, you would have to listen when it was on, right? And here you can just do it at your own convenience. It's like radio, but it's the internet, right?
Yeah, it is very nice. Like you say, you can listen to it. And I did a search for our podcast today, just Growing in Grace podcast. And I found that it's actually posted in a lot of different places, stuff that I didn't post it to myself. So other people are apparently, or maybe there are these websites that catch podcasts or podcast catchers, and all the episodes are found on these other sites. And so it's really neat. I really like it. You can search for Growing in Grace and find it in a lot of ways. And like you say, you can go back and listen from the very beginning if you want to on the website, growingingrace.org. Someone on the Grace Roots page on Facebook, facebook.com/Grace Roots, said that she was going through some older ones. I think she's into the 400s now. We're at number 665 today, and someone's gone back and listening to those, taking in a few at a time, and that is really cool because, like you said, there used to be Christian talk programs. What was that one? Night Sounds. I used to listen to that.
Yeah, Bill
Pierce. Night Sounds, and it's really relaxing.
The deep, soothing voice.
10:30 at night, and just a nice, calm voice to listen to. But if I missed it, then I missed it.
That was awesome.
And you couldn't hear it anymore. But he I remember him saying he recorded his about 7 weeks in advance, which is somewhat similar to what we do. A lot of these are we're actually recording now. It won't air for a few weeks here, but
yeah, at least a few weeks anyway. I was doing some messaging through Facebook Messenger with somebody. It's been a couple months back probably, but we're going through a few questions, and he kind of made the comment, because we were having some back and forth there about a particular subject, and he's been a podcast listener for, I think, many years from a different country. You may have heard of it, Joel, California. Anyway, I'm only kidding.
No, you're
not. But he said it's kind of surreal even that I'm talking to you here right now on Messenger, because I've listened to you for so long that, we've kind of held you and Joel up in pretty high esteem. And I got a chuckle out of that because, we're just regular guys here, just talking about the good news of Jesus Christ, also called the gospel. And that's going to be what we're talking about today. It's also one of the first things we talked about when we started the podcast some 13 years ago. When people hear the word gospel, it's a common word. It's a word that's very commonplace in Christianity and other religious circles, the gospel. So what is the gospel? We had somebody write into us and ask if we could talk a little bit about that, because it's one of those words that people hear. Maybe, Joel, if we pulled aside 50 pastors or even just 50 believers and asked them, what is the gospel? You might get close to 50 different answers, close to it.
Yeah.
So, let's have this discussion.
Yeah, I think it's a good one to have because we talk about the gospel all the time. The good news. That's what gospel means. It means good news, and we talk about it here. And so what are you guys saying? Yeah, that's the question. When you say gospel, what do you mean by that? And the thing that, Cap, you and I go back to all the time is Romans 1. Paul talks about the gospel because in this email that this person sent, he asked, there's good news, so was there bad news? When did it start? Does it end? Does it solve a problem? Does it solve multiple problems? What's so good about it? If I hear the gospel, what does that mean to me? how can my life change because of it? And so it's good to define what we're talking about by the gospel, because we do believe that hearing the gospel, knowing the good news definitely does change a life. It is contrasted with some bad news. Let's just real quickly, Romans 1:16.
Hey, Joel,
Sure.
Joel, before you get into the good news, what is the bad news? I mean, I don't think you and I have really had that discussion. Can we take just a minute or two to elaborate on what the bad news is? It's pretty simple to me.
Yeah, here I was getting into Romans 1:16 and 17, but right after that, he kind of spends basically 2 chapters on what the bad news is. In verse 18 of Romans 1, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has showed it to them." And he goes on and talks about how people are denying God in his creation. His invisible attributes are clearly seen through what he has made, but God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of everybody who suppresses the truth in unrighteousness. And so that's one aspect of the bad news. And unfortunately, some people read that verse and that passage at the second half of Romans 1, and they apply that to Christianity, but that's actually the bad news that was the reason why the good news was needed. And so that's part of the bad news.
Yeah, Paul did start out talking, which you were about ready to dive into, and we'll get to it here in just a minute, in the first part of Romans 1, where he talks about the righteousness of God being revealed, and then he goes on after that, like you were saying, to reflect back on what the bad news really was, and he keeps going with that, really until further into Romans chapter 3. The nutshell version here, if you were going to pluck something out, you get into Romans 3, and Paul kind of summarizes it, and he says, everybody, whether you're Jew or Gentile, everybody has fallen short. Nobody has been able to work to a place to attain a standard where they're acceptable to God or where they're right with God. And so, I mean, that's not good news, right? So if it's not good news, it's bad news. So there's a bad news, good news scenario, and the bad news kind of came first. You want the good news or the bad news? Well, a lot of people will prefer to hear the bad news first just to get it over with. And that's kind of what we were doing here, I guess, in essence, was the bad news is everybody falls short of the perfect standard that was required by a holy God.
Right. So that's why the good news was needed. And the good news of God's righteousness being given to us as a gift, because man, again, the bad news, man on his own could not do it. All have sinned and fall short, like you said. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and that's not good. And so we're left on our own to do this thing by ourselves, and we can't do it. And so, because we couldn't do it, God stepped in. He had this plan from the beginning. He had always planned on doing this. He foretold it to Adam and Eve, and all throughout the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, it was foretold that this was going to happen, and this is what happened. Romans 1:17, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So in the gospel, not my righteousness, not your righteousness, not my good works, not my good deeds, not what I could do to have righteousness in front of God, but God's righteousness is revealed. And so then, like we said, you spend the next 2 chapters, Paul is talking about this bad news, how all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Then he gets back to the good news. But now, he says, in Romans 3:21, but now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed. It's the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe. And so that's the good news, that even though we all fell short, God provided the gift of his very own righteousness, and we can receive it freely by faith.
It's so interesting, considering how we laid things out there, how Paul opened up with, hey, something has been revealed that had previously been a mystery, and it was the righteousness of God revealed in the gospel. See, that's why that's such a cornerstone passage for us to fall back on when we're trying to define what the real gospel is, what the good news is. And what makes this so interesting is the righteousness of God was going to be revealed in us as a gift. It's neat, too, there in Romans 1:16 and 17, when Paul is revealing this new information. And then he kind of takes that commercial time out, like what you were talking about, for the rest of chapter 1, all of chapter 2, and much of chapter 3. It's almost like he's referring back to the way things played out, in a sense. And then he gets to towards the end of Romans 3, and it's almost like he said, okay, now back to what I started talking about, the righteousness of God now revealed apart from the law. Apart from the law. How is that different from what Israel was doing? Well, if we jump ahead, Paul continues this thread throughout the book of Romans, but toward the end of Romans chapter 9, he said, what shall we say then? That Gentiles, non-Jewish people, who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is, righteousness that is by faith, not works. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They've stumbled over the stumbling stone. And then he went on to say that Christ would become the end of the law to everyone who believes. So the righteousness of God in us revealed apart from works, apart from that old Jewish law, and it became something that would be available to us Gentiles as well as the Jewish people.
Right. And so how does this change my life? Oh, my goodness. I mean, well, for one thing, I know that I can't boast in front of God. I can't say, God, look at the things that I've done. There's no instance ever in my life where I can say, God, look at what I have done. Give me some applause. I've performed well enough for you. No, it's all on him. The performance was all on Jesus Christ. And it means, therefore, that I can stop trying to perform to maintain a sense of rightness or righteousness with God. I can stop trying to jump through hoops. I can just rest fully in what he has done. And then it also means that I've been made a new creation. That's stuff for another time, I think. But we have been made new creations in Christ. We died and we no longer live. That's the result of the gospel, the good news, all of the work that Jesus did on our behalf. And so it's good news all around now. Everything in the Lord Jesus Christ is good. His goodness is in us, his righteousness. We've received it as a free gift by grace through faith. So that's kind of just a brief little talk about what the good news is. Next week, it's podcast number 666. Can you believe it? We've made it that far. So we'll be talking about something along that line. It has to do with the end times. Not so much, not at all really, about our views on the end times, but when people discuss the end times these days, there's a lot of arguing. There's a lot of division. We'll be talking about, ways that we can perhaps put an end to that next week. Growing in Grace.
This has been Growing in Grace with Mike Kapler and Joel Brueseke. Heard online through various internet sources around the world each week. To access hundreds of past programs, visit graceroots.org. Share it with a friend and listen again next week for more Growing in Grace.